Alrighty, hello, my name is Jacob, and I'm going to be going over the Chords of Color passage from the ACT English Form 16 MC2. I will be focusing on questions 61 through 75 of this particular passage. So, before I get started, I just think it's a good idea to read through the passage in its entirety before we delve into the questions. This may or may not be a tactic that you utilize on the ACT itself, but for the sake of practicing, I'm going to go through the passage before going through the questions. So, Chords of Color. Some viewers see the paintings of abstract artist James Little as impersonal, discordant rainbows. Others see them as minimalistic distillations of emotion. In other words, they are metaphors for Little's feelings about social issues and historical events. He paints large-scale patterns of shapes, mostly triangles and narrow rectangles in vibrant, contrasting hues. His paintings explore the ambiguity of space, the energy of movement, and the coming together of unlikely elements, but his subject, he says, is color. In 2011, working out of his studio in Brooklyn, New York, Little is painting on canvas using his own blend of beeswax and oil paint. He applies at least 15 layers of these paints that he blended himself to achieve a thick, smooth, color-soaked, luminescent surface. Most of his paintings are voluminous, about 6 feet by 8 feet. To create sharp visual breaks and clean edges of color in these expansive works, he paints slashing diagonal lines and rays. In his 2005 painting, Bittersweet Victory, by all means, the canvas is bisected by a vertical beige line on the left half, 3 orange triangles in a row, each one which stretched from the bottom to the top of the canvas's left half, angle slightly to the right on a purple background. On the right half, 3 vertical bands of dark green, one edge of each band slanting to create a point that touches the top of the canvas, cuts through a lime green background. Little explains that the internal spaces in his paintings, created by the lines of blocks of color, need to play off each other in a way that lends rhythm and unity to the whole work. The effect is much like something that would remind you of a perfect jazz collaboration. One of Little's favorite assessments of his work came from a woman who told him that his paintings are optimistic. Little believes the bold, positive energy infusing his work comes from what he observes around him. His paintings reflect what he considers the essence of our experiences as human beings, the malleable nature of space, the surprising shifts, but, in the end, a balance. So, going through that reading, we probably were able to pinpoint a couple parts of the passage that don't necessarily make sense, and that will lend its way into helping us actually be able to determine the correct answers for 61 through 75. And it also gives us an idea of what the passage means overall. But if we were to start on question 1, and it points us to the part of the passage that it's referring to, so I'll just read that over again. Others see them as minimalistic distillations of emotion. In other words, they are metaphors for Little's feelings about social issues and historical events. Right away, we know that the current sentence is incorrect because it is combining 2 sentences without a period or semicolon, so no change is incorrect. And options B and C are essentially doing the same thing that A is doing, which is incorrect. So all we are left with is D. And if we were to read the sentence replacing D with the underlined portion of the passage, we can see that the sentence is more correct. Others see them as minimalistic distillations of emotion, metaphors for Little's feelings about social issues and historical events. In this particular instance, D, the emotion comma, is functioning as a word plus a comma that combines independent clause with a dependent or non-necessary clause. So in this case, we know that D is correct. If we're going to question 62, which choice is correctly punctuated and makes clear that all the shapes that Little paints are painted in vibrant and contrasting hues? The important part of question 62 is that the question is asking which choice is correctly punctuated and makes clear. So those are the 2 things that we're going to have to be focusing on. So you would have to pick the question that is most correctly punctuated, that makes the idea most clear. So just reading the part of the passage, He paints large-scale patterns of shapes, mostly triangles and narrow rectangles in vibrant contrasting hues. The sentence as itself makes it sound like the triangles and narrow rectangles are the shapes that are in contrasting hues, but it's in fact all the shapes that Little paints that are in these hues. So F, no change, is incorrect. If we keep going through the options, if we try G, for example, and replace G with the underlined portion, he paints large-scale patterns of shapes, mostly triangles and narrow rectangles, in vibrant and narrow let me start over. He paints large-scale patterns of shapes, mostly triangles and narrow rectangles in vibrant contrasting hues. This sentence separates mostly triangles and narrow rectangles with the hyphens correctly, so that the sentence is still portraying the idea that all the shapes that Little paints are in these vibrant contrasting hues, and it's correctly punctuated. So we could go through H and J, but we would see that they either aren't correctly punctuated or they don't make it clear that all the shapes the Little paints are in these vibrant and contrasting hues. So in this case, we know that G is correct. On to question 63. His paintings explore the ambiguity of space, the energy of movement, and the coming together of unlikely elements. But his subject, he says, is color. If you read "but his subject, he says, is color," it sounds, or in its current state, it sounds like it's drawn out too much because there are commas missing. So question 63 is asking us to work with commas. As the sentence is, it's not correct because there aren't commas separating the non-essential clause of he says. So if you were to say the sentence out loud, your mind might even correct it without even thinking about it. But a subject, he says, is color. So saying it like that, we can tell that he says is a non-essential clause, and non-essential clauses have to be separated from the main clause by commas, and the only option that does that is C, or B. The only option that does that is B, so we know that B is the option that is correct. Question 64 is a question that's more based on meaning. So the question is asking, at this point, the writer is considering adding the following statement. Little also says that Syracuse University, where he earned his MFA in 1976, was a beacon for abstract painting. And we are tasked with determining if the writer should add this statement. If we were reading, his paintings explore the ambiguity of space, blah, 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 but a subject, he says, is color, and then we learn that he went to Syracuse University, it doesn't really make sense with the rest of the passage. So we know that one of the options, or we know that the answer has to be one of the options with no, because that piece of information that the question is asking if it should be added doesn't really make sense with the rest of the passage, because it's blurring the focus of what has been previously stated. And the option that deals with the fact that this addition blurs the passage is H. So we know that H is the correct answer because the following statement in 64 blurs the focus of the first paragraph, and the information that it's adding isn't necessarily related to what the passage itself is dealing with. So on to question 5. If we were just to read the part of the passage that it's dealing with, he applies at least 15 layers of these paints that he blended himself to achieve a thick, smooth, color-soaked, luminescent surface. This is one of the types of questions that we have to read the sentences prior to actually understand what the correct answer would be. So just starting at the beginning of the paragraph. In 2011, working at a studio in Brooklyn, New York, Little is painting on canvas using his own blends of beeswax and oil paint. He applies at least 15 layers of these paints that he blended himself to achieve a thick, smooth, color-soaked, luminescent surface. What you might have noticed right away is that the first sentence said that Little paints using his own blends, and the second sentence also says that Little paints using his own blends. So this question 65 in particular is dealing with redundancy. And so we know that no change is not correct because as it is, the question 65 is redundant. So we don't want to keep it as it is. So no change is out of the picture. And question B and C also mentioned that these paints that Little makes or Little uses are of his own blends. The only option in 65 that eliminates redundancy is D. So D is the correct answer. And if we would substitute D within the passage, we would get two sentences that don't necessarily say the same thing. So, in 2011, working out of his studio in Brooklyn, New York, Little is painting on canvas using his own blends of beeswax and oil paint. He applies at least 15 layers of these blends to achieve a thick, smooth, color-soaked, luminescent surface. So we can see that that doesn't restate what has already been said. On to question 65. The answer is J. And this is one of the questions that just deals with avoiding unnecessary verbiage and getting the idea out in the simplest way, but also in the most clear way. So the part of the passage that the question was referring to, most of his paintings are voluminous, about 6 feet by 8 feet. Voluminous doesn't really make sense because it just means taking up a lot of space, and that could mean by width, that just could mean a lot of things, so that option isn't very clear, and it's also very, very exaggerated almost, and we see this exaggeration with immeasurable and mountainous. Those are exaggerations, and those aren't necessarily clear. The clearest answer and the most concise answer is large, so most of his paintings are large, about 6 feet by 8 feet. If you come into contact with a question that is asking you to choose what word is best, 9 times out of 10, the answer is going to be the shortest option that just presents the idea that the passage wants to in the quickest way. On to question 67 now. In his 2005 painting Bittersweet Victory, By All Means, the canvas is bisected by a vertical beige line.